At the risk of dating this episode, this review marks the 10th review that I will have written and produced for this series so far. This isn't me preparing to throw in the towel or anything, but rather something I fairly recently realised before I went into writing the script for this one. Once I realised that, I pondered the idea of doing reviews of games that I would say are special to me in some way or another as milestones. They don't necessarily have to be the best games, or even particularly good, just memorable in a way that I can look back on and think, this is special. And the game that we have for this episode is a good one. A very good one, in fact. In fact, of all of Nintendo's first-party games on the Super Nintendo, I would say that this game is my favourite of theirs. Favourite in the entire franchise? No, but it's close. How can I say that this game is special? Well, let me put it this way. This is the game that served as the backbone for the series' 2D installments pretty much up to today. And every game released in this series since has played with this game's structure in some way or another. It's influential, to put it into a single word. It's also one of those few games where hearing about a major speedrunning event hosting a run or a race with this game makes me want to watch it, purely to see the game being played by people who are far, far better than I will ever be at it. And incidentally, I recall writing a review on GameSpot for this game a touch over 10 years ago. First off, ow, I feel old. And secondly, reading through it again, all I can say is I am glad that I've learned to be a bit more restrained in my approach to writing. So, now that we've established that this is a very important game to me, that it's influential, and that it's one of the games that got me into this whole reviewing thing in the first place some time back, let's have a look at what I consider to be one of the best games ever made. Here we go. It's Super Metroid. Super Metroid is a 2D action-adventure game co-developed by Nintendo R&D 1 and Intelligent Systems and published by Nintendo for the Super Famicom in 1994. In it, you play the role of Samus Aran, a bounty hunter who, after receiving a distress signal, goes to a research colony before finding herself directed towards the planet Zebes, the setting for the original Metroid, to take on the many hostile creatures which plague the planet's subsurface. When people tend to think of the Metroid series, they either tend to think of Metroid Prime, which I do want to cover at some point, or this game, simply because it's the game that solidified the concepts introduced in the first two games in a way that truly supersedes what came before. It reviewed very well, with most publications giving the game very high scores, resulting in it being ranked as the top Super Nintendo game on game rankings up until the site's closure in 2019. With reviews praising everything from its atmosphere, its gameplay, its control, and its incredible use of sound, among other things. With that being said, the game struggled to make a particularly massive splash at the time of its release, partly due to the game releasing months before the up-and-coming 5th generation of consoles, as well as the game's non-linear nature being at odds with what Japanese audiences were used to at the time. A considerable amount of its popularity would come post-millennium, when newer games and twists on the series would release, almost 9 years after Super Metroid. Still, the fact that more games eventually released does at least mean the series is popular to some degree. But enough about whether it was popular at the time or whatever. We're here to actually look at the game, so let's have a look at the packaging real quick. Before we roll with the Japanese cover, however, let's have a look at what came out in the West with an admittedly iconic, but also somewhat hilarious cover. For a start, Ridley being straight red is rather odd, all things considered. Maybe Samus got him to very low health already in the battle against him, but what's also not great here is how it tries to go for scale, but ends up looking empty and small. Ridley looks about the size of a small house. At least compared to the Japanese box art, Ridley looks like he's far away in the distance and we have more creatures to look at. The environment pictured in the cover looks like it has things in it. It's not featureless and just vague rocks, it has structures in the distance. This is one instance where the Japanese cover is by far and away the better of what was available across the board. It accomplishes a sense of scale that the other simply doesn't have, makes the monsters appear properly threatening, rather than sticking out like a sore dragon, and it just has more to it. I also prefer that the Super Metroid logo is towards the bottom of this box, allowing it to facilitate this design. It feels less cluttered despite there being more going on in the background, compared to the logo that looks like it was thrown haphazardly onto the cover in the Western release. Anyhow, let's check out the back. The text is laid out very straightforwardly and is mostly legible with light text on a dark background, with the exception of this bit of text towards the bottom of the window. It's legible, but the logo behind it is fairly bright, making the text a bit harder to read. Maybe the back would be better if that logo wasn't there or if it was smaller and located elsewhere. Either way, there's a fair amount of stuff on the back here, and it's best that we move on from this in any event. So yeah, great front cover, and the back cover could have done with a little bit less stuff on it. And now it's time to look at what's in the box. My copy comes with the game, the manual, a little safety leaflet about the power adapter, and a quick reference card which contains the controls and a list of items that you may pick up throughout your time playing the game. The manual is pretty densely packed with a ton of information from the environments you'll go through, the enemies you'll face, the items you'll pick up, and information on the controls and options and all of that good stuff. The usual applies here. Some understanding of Japanese is recommended, a bit of info can still be scraped out without it, and the game teaches you how to play it pretty much as you go along, but we'll get to that in a moment. So let's take a look at the cartridge and how relatively ordinary it is on the outside. My only concern is that the front label isn't perfectly flush and seems to be coming away slightly from the edges, but it's still attached for the time being. Now to look inside it, and here we have a pretty beefy board with quite a lot of stuff on it. 5 chips, a few resistors, a capacitor, and one most welcome battery. All very nice and very useful. It's a very packed board with no shortage of stuff on it that I'm not sure I'm able to wrap my head around since I never studied electronics, but it's a very interesting thing to look at all the same. Now I've reassembled the cartridge, let's chuck her into the Super Famicom, and I'm going to shut up for a few seconds so that you can enjoy the pure majesty of this opening sequence. How about that? A beautifully eerie opening sequence that sets the tone for the game impeccably. The music slowly intensifying, the scrolling showing a few spooky details. I love it. We wait a few seconds more and we get in the tracked mode showing what we can do, but that's not too important to us right now. What we want to do right now is to get around to playing the game, so let's start up to be greeted with a voice.
The last Metroid is in captivity. The galaxy is at peace.
That was the voice of Dan Osen, the man who managed the localization of a solid number of Nintendo's first-party Super Famicom lineup, this included. Following on from that, we are given some context for the events leading up to this game, including what happened in the game previous to this, Metroid 2 Return of Samus, featuring stuff like encountering the baby Metroid. After encountering the baby Metroid, Samus departs the planet SR388 to go to a research colony to perform studies on the creature. Unfortunately for these scientists, however, there's an aggressively angry dragon-like space pirate who has a more malevolent interest in the Metroid. Samus then decides to intervene after receiving a distress signal, only to discover that all the researchers are dead and the Metroid is nowhere to be seen, except for in an empty room within a capsule, before Ridley appears right in front of us. This is a battle which you can either win or lose, but whichever path you take, the outcome remains the same. Ridley escapes, a self-destruct sequence initiates, and you've got to make your way out of the research colony before it explodes. Finally, you make your way out of the facility and into your craft, flying away from the exploding station and towards an all too familiar planet, Zebes. You make planetfall and leave your craft to be welcomed by an environment most eerie and isolating. perhaps now would be a reasonable time to go through the controls, particularly the basic ones for now. The more advanced things will come as and when. Firstly is basic movement. Pressing the D-pad left or right will move you in those directions. Up will have Samus aiming towards the ceiling, down will have Samus crouch, A makes Samus jump, holding the B button will allow you to dash while moving, the shoulder buttons will aim you diagonally up or down, and X will shoot a beam from your arm cannon. At first the controls seem like you will need to get used to them, and to be fair, this isn't exactly the most natural control scheme at first, but personally, I've used it often enough now that I don't even really need to think about it. And if the default control scheme sounds like a nightmare to you, you can modify what the face and shoulder buttons do in the options menu prior to starting the game, so the game does give you some leeway with controller options. I honestly think the controls in this game are the smoothest in any Metroid game. It enables a level of play that few games can really provide by being customizable, being open to newcomers, and be able to be mastered by people who know the game inside and out. Performing more advanced things in this game is relatively easy to learn with how the controls are set up, because you can perform a lot of actions quickly and in a manner that best suits your comfort and grip, as some speedrunners adopt a different grip in different situations. The more advanced stuff actually starts shortly after going through the basics as we proceed further down this cavern and fall down a huge shaft to reach a destroyed chamber that will be all too familiar to Samus and to those who have already played these games. We take an elevator down to the lower level where, to the left, is our first pickup in the game, the Morph Ball. It's probably the most iconic pickup, partly because it's the first one we get, but also because it makes the big Samus become the small Samus at a double press of the down button on the D-pad. In picking it up, however, we seem to have enabled some sort of system as a security light show begins. We continue delving around here to grab another important pickup, missiles. These are more powerful and more spammable than beam shots. Missiles are classed as a sub-weapon, which requires pressing the select button to arm and can be fired like the beams with the X button. You will get more sub-weapons as the game goes on, so the select button will be used to scroll through them. To deactivate your sub-weapons and reset your arm cannon's beam, press the Y button or cycle through all your sub-weapons. These sub-weapons will be especially useful throughout the game as we encounter a lot of doors which will require the use of these things to open. 5 missiles will open red doors, which sounds very expensive right now, but you will get a lot of missiles during regular play, so don't be alarmed. Anyway, we're pretty much done down here, so let's get going back up the elevator. Only to discover that we may have activated some sort of security system because the planet has now effectively woken up. There are many different types of enemies and creatures you will encounter throughout this game, and I don't really know if I can go through them all, but a few of them here are pretty noteworthy, like these wildly varying space pirates. There is some palette swapping as the game goes on, but it won't really matter too much. Considering the game's environments and how the enemies complement them, it's not really a bad thing for the most part, although a lot of these enemies are different in a good number of ways. Moving on back up the shaft, we find a few places where we can make use of our Morph Ball to roll through narrow spaces, because Metroid can't crawl or something. Anyway, we bust through a door, run past a swarm of flying things, bust open a red door, and pick up the missiles we spent. Once that's done, we go through the door and find a statue holding a present out for us, in the form of Morph Ball bombs. We try to leave the room, but the door locks behind us, and the statue decided it doesn't want to be a statue anymore and tries to kill us. Unsuccessfully. We get out of this room and make use of the bombs by pressing the fire button whilst in the Morph Ball mode to make our move towards the new region of Zebes, but not before picking up an energy tank. Now, I'm going to use this opportunity to go and talk about the many different things we can pick up in this game, as we collect quite a few things throughout this game. Throughout Super Metroid, you will collect up to 100 items, be it new weapons and tools, inventory expansions, or increases to your energy capacity. A number of the new weapons you will encounter will come in the form of new beams for your arm cannon. These will modify what comes out of your arm cannon, including things like a charge shot, which increases its power, an ice beam which can freeze enemies in place, and a plasma beam which shoots through enemies and does damage for each frame it touches an enemy. All of these different beams can be toggled in the pause menu and can even be used as special weapons with the right combinations, although you won't be required to use them and can go through the entire game without even thinking about them or even knowing about their existence. What you won't be doing through the game and forgetting about them shortly after, however, is picking up the different sub-weapons you can acquire. I've already made mention of the missiles, but there's two others that you will encounter as the game progresses. Firstly is the super missile. Super missiles are harder to come by and fewer in number across the span of the game, but they are also very powerful and can be used to blow open red and green doors alike with just a single super missile. The other weapon is the power bomb. Arm it with select and fire it while in morph ball mode, and you will activate an area of effect attack that sweeps beyond the boundaries of the screen and can blow open orange doors. They all have their uses and will come in very useful in all manners of situations. Each sub-weapon also has tiles all over the place that require the use of that particular weapon to pass through them, either to access another area or to acquire a new pickup. There are two other items that can be picked up which can be armed as sub-weapons but aren't really weapons necessarily, although you could use one of them as a weapon. Firstly is the grappling beam. This is fired like any other weapon, but it shoots a tractor beam that you can use to hook the beam onto a few different things and swing from them, using the directional pad to affect how much you swing. You can get some crazy speed from this. The other one is the X-ray visor, which reveals openings and blocks that can be destroyed and bypassed. This is much less useful for the most part, but for people on their first playthrough, or people trying for a 100% run, this can be pretty useful to understand what there is for you to go through. It's not the easiest game to navigate, so this helps to learn it. We'll go through a few other things that are important. I don't want this to turn into a guide, but there are a few other things in this game that are worth bringing up. I'll go through them as and when it's appropriate to do so. Suffice it to say you can pick up an awful lot of things in this game. Or you can do what a lot of speedrunners do with this game and pick up the absolute bare minimum, because of course speedrunners purposely do stuff like that. More on that later. As you play through Super Metroid, there is one thing you'll be doing perhaps more than anything else throughout your time, and that is exploring the labyrinthine caverns and otherworldly constructs, and the game for the most part leaves it down to you to figure out where to go and what to do. This is fairly typical for the Metroid franchise in general, in that you are dropped into an environment that progressively opens up as you go along, beat bosses, and collect items that you need in order to further your progress. Super Metroid eases you into this mindset as evidenced by how it funnels you at the start, but later opens things up a touch, just enough so that you don't get seriously lost. The game gets you to look around, to explore, to work out what is passable ground and what isn't, which tiles may be destroyed and by what means, and working out which rooms lead where and which ones are dead ends. You visit 6 biomes in this game: the Rocky Crateria, Brinstar, which has a vegetative half and a cavernous half, the Magmatic Norfair, the devastated and haunted wrecked ship, the drowned Meridia, and the game's final area, Turian. The game leaves plenty of subtle hints on where you're supposed to go, especially with how the map system works in this game. Throughout each of the biomes in this game, there will be a map station from which you can download a map to your suit. The map is accessible from the Start Pause menu, as well as via the minimap in the top right corner. Pink cells indicate that you have been in that area already, whilst blue cells indicate that it hasn't been accessed yet, though that relies on having the map downloaded, otherwise you will only see pink. If you're a little bit confused on where to go, check the map to see if there is an area you haven't been to yet and try to aim for that and see if there's anything there, as there usually is something there. Sometimes it will be a door you couldn't access at the time and maybe forgot about, other times it will be a tile that you needed to break open to reveal the previously unknown path, and if all else fails, just shoot and detonate a whole bunch of bombs at anything that looks a little suspicious. That isn't to say of course that everything is particularly obvious. I remember back in the day trying to access Meridia but not realising you needed to use a power bomb at the glass tunnel, but reaching the different biomes is generally quite easy despite that. It's easy for me at least. The vast majority of the map is burned into my brain to some degree, so I know most of the routes to different things and locations. That being said, I've never really done a 100% run and, honestly, I don't care to. This is a pretty personal thing to go into, but whenever I go into a game, I don't necessarily go into it wanting to experience absolutely everything the game offers on my first attempt. I want an incentive to return to it. On top of that, 100% runs in Metroid games, from what I've tried, require having to deal with a lot of stuff. I recall doing a 100% run in Metroid Prime 3 Corruption, and having a mare of a time because some of the things the game required you to do was so pointlessly obtuse. I blame corruption for colouring my perception of 100% completion in games, though Portal 2 did that years prior. And in Corruption's case, it was mostly pointless anyway, considering the missiles in that game are probably the most useless things in the entire series, right next to reserve tanks in Super Metroid. See, I'm going off the rails like those times where I went to an empty room that seemed important but turned out to have absolutely nothing in them. Great. We'll move on to one of this game's strong points now, and that is the presentation. The presentation in this game is, in a word, stellar. There isn't really a single thing I would improve, nor would I know how to improve anything for the most part. This is a game that oozes atmosphere. Genuinely, it turned atmosphere into a liquid and it's just seeping out of my Super Famicom as we speak. I should probably clean that up. To better explain things, let's go about this differently to how we usually do, and let's talk about the audio first. In my opinion, Super Metroid soundtrack is one of the best the Super Famicom has ever produced. Composed by Kenji Yamamoto and Minako Hamano, this soundtrack knows when to sound eerie, exciting, like a fight for your own survival, like you're almost literally exploring the bowels of the planet, or experiencing great triumph. It's brilliant. The best moments in this game's soundtrack are the moments where it's quiet. The moments where the music doesn't try to intrude on what's going on through the screen. The moments where it's mostly just you, with not many other things happening around you, like on the wrecked ship. But even when it aims for bombast, it is excellent. There are so many truly brilliant themes in the game that many of them stuck around for games to come. I wish I could better explain why this soundtrack is good, beyond music good, but it just carries so much atmosphere and style. And on the sound effects front, the game sounds pretty strong. Whilst a couple sound effects sound a bit subdued, sounds like the ones produced by the powerbomb explosion really let you know you've unleashed something powerful. The visuals also warrant quite a bit of praise too. It makes tremendous use of the 16-bit capabilities of the Super Famicom to create brilliant looking environments, cool enemy sprites, really nice effects, and a very well animated Samus. The smoothness that comes from how this game is presented is so nice and helps to make it all the more playable in combination with the game's 60 frames per second gameplay. Because you get very good feedback from many of the things in the game, it is all genuinely fantastic. Well, mostly fantastic. There are moments where the game chugs and can't handle everything that's happening on screen at a time, but usually those moments are pretty few and far between, and not often are they in situations that are damaging to the experience, but they are noticeable. I should probably talk about the bosses now as well. You've encountered a fair number of them throughout the game, and they are all quite varied in different ways. There are 4 bosses that are necessary to defeat in order to gain access to Turian at the end of the game, those 4 being Kraid, Phantoon, Dragon and Ridley. Kraid in Brinstar is a gargantuan monster that rises from beneath the ground on which it walks, shooting what can only be described as spiky platforms on which you can stand, as well as flinging the odd finger. Phantoon is a ghostly aberration which haunts the wrecked ship, and is arguably the most annoying boss on account of it giving you such little opportunity to attack it, especially since it goes through phases that take a little bit too long to go through. Dragon is found at the end of Meridia, swooping down like a hawk to attack its prey, whilst also shooting out white goo which, when it catches you, will slow you down and allow Dragon to pick you up and perform some pretty unspeakable acts, all things considered. Lastly, Ridley of Lower Norfair is a boss that you can just constantly attack. Whilst it constantly goes after you with sweeping attacks, projectiles which become ground-based area of effect attacks, stabbing what ground you can walk on, and generally being a pain in your backside. So much so in fact that Samus ends up having a bit of a moment whenever Ridley shows up in future games. But that's getting into stuff that's a bit too far from the relevant topic. The bosses in this game are all varied with different attack patterns and styles, as well as different ways to defeat each one of them. None of them feel samey or repetitive as a result. In fact, one boss I tend to find particularly easy to beat is Dragon, for one very simple reason. The environment can be made to work in your favour, simply by shooting the pods on the walls and exposing the electrical arcs. Then, when Dragon grabs onto you, you can grapple onto one of the arcs and use it to damage yourself slightly, but also damage Dragon massively. There's usually a lot of creative ways in which you can take down the different bosses in this game, even with the lesser bosses like Crocomile. Coming up with some interesting ways in which you can fight these bosses is half the fun of it all, really. Defeating the bosses does open up the game to you in a fair few ways, such as giving you access to a new power-up. We'll go through them in order, as well as some associated power-ups, and even a few others that you may acquire through the game. Defeating Kraid will net you access to the Varia suit, the iconic spear-shouldered suit, which enables you to resist high temperatures and access more of Norfair as a result, as well as reducing the damage you take by 50%. Defeating Phantoon will repower the wrecked ship, enabling you to more openly navigate the area. Within it, you should find the Gravity suit, which not only adds a tinge of purple to your suit, but also gives you a further 25% damage reduction, as well as the ability to move in water as you would out of it, and even be able to move through lava with no damage. It's perfect for use in Meridia, where you encounter Dragon. Defeating Dragon will net you the space jump, which allows you to continuously jump in order to maintain movement off the ground and access places that might otherwise prove tricky without it. You can power it up by defeating the Golden Torizo statue in Norfair to acquire the Screw Attack, a weapon that turns Samus herself into a missile. Jump in the direction of an enemy and they will die. Usually. Ridley unfortunately doesn't really offer a power-up or new item or anything, just an energy tank for your troubles. By this point you're a walking arsenal that can fling yourself into enemies, so the game doesn't really give you that much more. In fairness, better it gives you an energy tank than a reserve tank. Oh yeah, reserve tanks. You can pick up 4 of these and use them to store energy in them in order to refill your depleted energy upon hitting 0 automatically, or manually refilling them in the pause menu. It's functionally an energy tank that you can't see. Getting an actual energy tank is better in pretty much every metric though, because you not only replenish all energy upon picking one up, but you can get more of them, and they also show up on the interface whilst in play. My favourite power-up, however, is found in Norfair. You run through a corridor which has bits of ground which disintegrate beneath you as you run on them. You go through the door, however, and you find an item that changes how you move for quite a serious chunk of the game. I present to you the Speed Booster. Before, holding the B button would merely increase your speed as you moved. Now, not only does it increase your speed, but it also makes you incredibly lethal, as you can hold enough momentum to be able to perform a move known as a Shine Spark. Press down to store a Shine Spark and you have a few seconds to use it to yeet yourself in the direction of your choosing. With that being said, be sure you have plenty of health to do this, otherwise you will end up doing yourself a lot more harm than good. That being said, killing oneself by running almost literally out of one's own skin does sound like a novel way to go out. Quite a blaze of glory. The Speed Booster is an incredibly fun tool for sure. You can atomise scenery and enemy alike, and the fact you can perform the Shine Spark with it is also really awesome. What's also really cool is that the game gives you the chance to learn about both the Shine Spark and another advanced movement skill in secret. You don't need either of these to beat the game, although it can make things a little quicker. In Brinstar, in the corridor that leads towards the Spore Spawn boss, you can run on a row of tiles that will break if you have the Speed Booster, dropping you down into a shaft. What follows is a bit of a rummage around to see what there is until you encounter a creature. It's not hostile, you can't really harm it, it's just there to show you a little thing you can do. Just run with the Speed Booster active and you can store a Shine Spark and jump up to reach the top and burst through the floor again. Similarly, in a nearby part of Brinstar is an area you can open up with power bombs, leading you through a couple tricky chambers before you encounter a few critters who decide to jump off the walls to reach the top. And with that, you've discovered yet another advanced movement technique. Wall jumping is one of the trickier techniques to pull off consistently as it requires you to time things correctly. Thankfully, the game is forgiving in this area because it does give you a ledge to fall back on to make sure you get to the top in a less aggravating manner. However, this game does enable you to break it somewhat by jumping using only the one wall. I don't tend to do this often because it's a little harder to pull off for me, but it's plenty doable if you practice it. And that's not the last of the movement techniques. Bomb jumping is something you learn to do quite quickly, and it's not usually particularly complex in the situations you have to use it, but if you want to be a show-off, you can try to string bomb jumps together to access some areas or get some new power-ups early. Alternatively, you can bumble about Meridia for a while and find the spring ball, which allows you to jump in morph ball mode without having to wait for a bomb to go off. You can even get some stuff like the high jump boots to increase your jump height substantially, and make accessing certain areas easier than ever before. You get so many things that in turn give you so many different ways to go about playing the game. I think I've gone over pretty much all the items you can pick up in this game and the different advanced movement techniques you can pull in this game. There are a fair number of things that I haven't covered, but that's mainly because I'm not the right person to cover them. That said, I will touch on some of these things in a bit. For now, however, we've taken down the 4 major bosses around here and collected the 4 Lord's Souls. Wait, hang on, that's the wrong game. We take the elevator down to the belly of the beast, as it were. There are things in the depths, so down to Turian we go to vanquish a familiar foe, Metroids. The very thing this franchise is named after, Metroids are very tricky enemies to deal with. For a start, you can't damage these things with just the beam. You need to use the ice beam in conjunction with 5 missiles or a super missile to kill it after holding it in place. If you're unfortunate enough to be caught by them, you'll have to try and bomb them off of you and get some clear space between you and it. It's not easy and it can be pretty annoying when it takes a bit of time for it to actually work, but it is what it is. I will say, however, that the background audio for this part of the game sounds really creepy. If you've heard the original Metroid's version of Turian's theme, you can pick out the tune, but it's layered behind so many weird bubbling and gurgling sounds. It can sound genuinely unsettling. Eventually, we make our way into a pretty dusty environment. A few hoppers occupy the room, and none of them can be damaged whatsoever, as they're impervious to any and all attacks. We just have to move on to the next room. Here we see a large Torizo statue, or not, because it wasn't a statue. It's a desiccated husk of a Torizo warrior, one assumes, and as soon as we come into contact with it, it disintegrates. We move on moments later to the next chamber. More husks appear before we move a little further into the room and encounter another hopper. We can't really do anything with it though. So what now? Oh, okay, that's what, a big ass Metroid out of nowhere! The hopper had absolutely no chance to survive, being sapped of all its life force, turning into a dry pile of dust. The Metroid's next target? You. And it isn't letting go, no matter what you hit with it. So I guess we're just gonna waste away and die now. Guess those reserve tanks are coming in useful now, huh? Wait, it stopped at 1 energy point? Wait, is this the baby? All grown up? How the hell is it this massive? This isn't baby fat, surely. I mean, at this point, is there any good in asking? Probably not. It decides to leave us alone in the end, and we can move on out of here. We quickly refill our energy, go through a few relatively simple chambers, and make our way to an all too familiar room, assuming you've played the original Metroid in some capacity. This room has a whole pool of acid, small platforms to stand on, automated defense guns which shoot in predetermined directions, things that spawn party rings or whatever, and your current target is to get to the other side by blowing through those barriers. Missiles are the way to go since they're spammable and in substantial supply, and if you need to go get some more, you can always return to the recharge room and continue plugging away until the way is open to whatever is at the end of the room, which just so happens to be a being called Mother Brain. We destroyed her in the original Metroid though, surely. But now she's shut herself in her jar and relied solely on the automated defences to take care of me, I suppose. In any case, we destroy her glass cage, pummel her with missiles, super missiles, and charged beam shots before she explodes and the environment changes around us. And I don't like how this looks like we're being trapped here. So, here we are with a new and improved Mother Brain with an assortment of attacks including time-delayed bombs, a burst fire ring attack, a weird laser attack of sorts, and a shot from her arm which does quite a lot of damage all things considered. But then she stops attacking briefly, only to seem like she's charging up quite a bit. This doesn't look like this is going to end well for me, does it? Yep, sure enough, it's done a massive number on Samus's energy reserves. We can continue to try and attack her, but once again, she charges up, preparing to bring us down even further, and firing her attack with abandon. We're exhausted. Samus can't muster the strength to pick herself up off the ground, and Mother Brain is whittling down our health further. Sure enough, she charges her attack up again to finish the job, and fire— oh shit, it's the baby! Just in the nick of time, the baby Metroid latches onto Mother Brain and drains her of her own life force. Thank goodness there's a Metroid out there who can help us. In fact, it refills our own energy. But Mother Brain looks like she's regaining herself. She stirs, bit by bit, before she lets out a roar and opens fire on the Metroid that is replenishing our lost energy. The baby Metroid is increasingly discoloured as it's damaged until it flies away to go in for one final attack, but to no avail. But in death, the baby Metroid leaves a parting gift to Samus. We are powered up to hell and back with a beam attack that absolutely tears through Mother Brain, so we go to town on her. We fire at her head, shot after shot causing her to recoil, until she can take no more, collapses, and ultimately disintegrates. We've vanquished the ultimate evil. And now it's time to get the hell off the planet. We have a few rooms to go through, some of which can be made quicker to go through using methods like the Shine Spark, but it's a simple escape sequence that the series is rather well known for. But there is one thing. You remember those animals you encountered earlier in the game, showing you the ways in which you can get through the various obstacles by performing advanced movements? Well, they're tucked away pretty close to your initial entry point on Zebes, in the room where you got the bombs. Shoot open the wall to let them out, and although they'll be hesitant at first, they'll move away before the lava takes them. Now you just have to hurry up and get the hell out of there and onto your ship. We are on our ship now, but the game zooms out gradually, seeing the planet move further and further away from us until it is a relatively small circle on the screen. The planet looks like it's about to explode, and then— it erupts, creating a bright light in the void. And once everything cools off, we see Samus' ship come into view and tells us we did a good job at beating the game in a timely fashion. And credits. But not quite yet, because there are a few things I want to get into, namely its legacy, its future as a series, and, of course, whether it is worth importing or not. By all accounts, Super Metroid is a legendary game. It's possibly the best action platformer on the Super Famicom, and can quite comfortably stand in the rankings among the greatest games of all time. And it has a legacy that endures to this day for a number of reasons. There are a fair few things that this game is responsible for codifying in a good number of ways, with two particularly massive concepts in particular. To start out, how many of you tune into Games Done Quick? If you're unfamiliar with it, Games Done Quick is a biannual speedrunning event which takes place over the span of a week, showcasing some high-level gameplay, demonstrating ways in which players can exploit the content and programming of games and beating them as quickly as possible. Every time a GDQ event rolls around, there is always a few games that I look for in the schedule to see if I can check out the VODs for them later, like Half-Life, Quake, Silent Hill. But there's usually one that I want to watch live as it happens. If it happens. And that is Super Metroid. If I hadn't looked into the speedrunning for this game, I most probably wouldn't be as into this game as I currently am. I would probably have just gone, yeah, that was a good game, when I played it for the first time on the Wii Virtual Console, and probably left it at that for the most part. But seeing people play Super Metroid in speedruns got me into wanting to play this game again. I also wanted to play it on proper hardware rather than on a Wii, so I got a Super Famicom and eventually grabbed a copy of this game for, I want to say £65, which is more than I paid for Metroid Prime Trilogy for what it's worth. But yes, watching Super Metroid speedruns, or speedruns for most Metroid games really, is a properly entertaining exercise for me. I genuinely love watching them, seeing how runners break the game and be truly capable of what they do. And speedrunning this game in particular has a fair number of techniques that can be performed in this game. Want to get the super missile early without fighting Spore Spawn? Perform a Mach Ball manoeuvre at the entrance to one of the upper rooms in Brinstar? Want to beat the bosses in a completely different order? You can do that. You get to fight Phantoon first, for example. Have fun with that on your any percent run. And this game has been mapped in and out now, and most of the optimum routes have been uncovered, with so many different categories for this game, enabling players to give the whole thing a go. I'm not of that level by any stretch of the imagination, but damn it if it isn't interesting to me. If you're interested in learning more about the speedruns for Super Metroid, not only would I recommend you search for the VODs, for the runs on YouTube, but I would also recommend watching Summoning Salt's retrospective on the any percent category. It goes into a lot more detail for the speedrun than I could possibly go into, given my knowledge and experience on the subject being somewhat limited. And of course, there's another concept that I want to talk about, where this game's legacy is a major part of. Basically, have you played a game like Axiom Verge, Ori and the Blind Forest, Touhou Lunar Nights, or Hollow Knight recently? Or, as a bit of a curveball, Dark Souls? What I listed off there were 5 games that could be referred to as Metroidvanias. The Metroid part is self-explanatory, but the Vania suffix is from Castlevania Symphony of the Night, a game that was designed to keep a player engaged for longer by having them play through a vast labyrinthine map. Whilst 1986's Metroid arguably introduced the idea of a vast map the player can navigate in a 2D space in an action game, and whilst Metroid 2 Return of Samus from 1991 brought it to a handheld, Super Metroid was arguably the first to feel like a properly polished experience, not gimped by technical issues or limitations brought on by the hardware. As a result, Super Metroid's gameplay concept of having you navigate a substantial map with areas being opened up to you as you collect items and find ways in which you can access areas that would otherwise be impossible or at least impractically difficult, solidified the game's staying power. It didn't feel like it was fighting against the console's hardware, unlike in Metroid, which, although revolutionary, was about as stable as a mental patient, and these days there are better ways to play this game than the original, as we'll go into in a bit. It also didn't feel like it was limited by the constraints of the hardware, like it was in Metroid 2 Return of Samus. It's impressive to me that the game came out on the original Game Boy, but the device's limits, including a small, low-resolution monochrome screen, really limited the game's appeal. There was intended to be a director's cut version of the game for the Game Boy Color, in the same vein as The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening, but it never came to fruition. However, there are ways in which the game can be played in colour, be it through a Super Game Boy or a Game Boy player. In the end, Super Metroid has left an indelible mark on speedrunning and the way in which games like this can be played. And it also gave rise to the development of an entire subgenre of action games. And with that, I will now dive into what followed from this game. Upon release, Super Metroid was the 3rd game in the series, as evidenced by it having Metroid 3 appear in the game's Attract mode. Metroid and Metroid 2 Return of Samus were the first 2 games, each releasing on the NES and Famicom Disk System and the Game Boy. Metroid would receive a remake of sorts in 2004 for the Game Boy Advance, called Metroid Zero Mission. which reimagined the entire game whilst maintaining the similar structure. The end result is a very colourful, well presented and nicely expanded version of the original classic. Similarly, Metroid 2, Return of Samus would be remade in 2017, this time for the 3DS, called Metroid Samus Returns. This was primarily developed by Spanish developers Mercury Steam, and much like Zero Mission, Samus Returns would be a massive overhaul, playing in 2.5D and introducing a few new things. As for original games, Metroid would have to wait 8.5 years for a new game, as Metroid would only have a presence on the Nintendo 64 in the shape of Samus appearing as a playable fighter in Super Smash Bros., with no full Metroid game appearing on the system. Instead, 2 new games would release in November 2002. One of these was Metroid Prime, developed by Retro Studios for the GameCube, and bringing the series into the third dimension and in first person. Much like Super Metroid, Metroid Prime stakes its claim as one of the greatest games of all time, but I'm gonna hold off on talking about it for the time being. Instead, let's talk about Metroid Fusion. Developed by Nintendo R&D 1 for the Game Boy Advance, it takes place at the current end of the timeline. It's also the closest the series gets to being a full horror game, featuring such lovely abominations as the Nightmare and the SAX, which stalks you at points. Personally, I'm a bit colder towards this game. It's a perfectly solid game and I do like a lot of it, including the atmosphere, but some of the level design choices it makes are dubious at best to me, and it's also arguably the hardest game in the series, as it gives you relatively little room to manoeuvre. From here, the official games would focus primarily on being 3D, with the Prime games taking centre stage, with 2004's Metroid Prime 2 Echoes releasing for the GameCube, the DS seeing a demo version and a complete version for Metroid Prime Hunters, and minifying the FPS gameplay onto a handheld, and a motion control filled 2007 Wii game called Metroid Prime 3 Corruption. The 3 console Metroid Prime games would release in the West on the Wii as a collection called Metroid Prime Trilogy, and it released in limited numbers, making copies quite expensive now, but it's arguably the best way to play the games. Japan would get each of the games released as standalone games, however. Oh, and at some point there was a pinball game on the DS. Naturally. The Wii would see another game in the series, but it's also quite possibly the most divisive in the entire series. Metroid Other M would release in 2010, with development work from Team Ninja, famous for their work on the Ninja Gaiden and Dead or Alive series. It's a fully 3D game, with situations where the player may play the game like a side-scroller, and it features a third-person perspective with the ability to point the Wii remote at the screen to aim in first person. And it also gave Samus a voice, which was received about as well as you would expect. People were not happy to see a vulnerable side to Samus, a character previously known to be able to rise above trauma. It also didn't help that the game crammed in an entire control system into a single Wii remote, making it tricky to play in some regards. In the end, it has its fans, but I wouldn't be able to tell you if I rank myself among them, since I haven't played that much of the game at all. Metroid Other M was regarded as the game that killed the Metroid franchise, as Metroid would not see another game released for 6 years. And the game that released in the end was Metroid Prime Federation Force, a 3DS first-person cooperative game developed by Canadian developers Next Level Games. Considering it had you playing as nobodies instead of the series icon Samus, was focused purely on shooting action and not on exploration and atmosphere, and lacked any sort of traditional single-player mode, Federation Force went down about as well as a fresh glass of vomit. The game failed to break into the sales charts particularly highly, and reviews tended towards the middle more than anything, and the game's trailer received so many dislikes that Nintendo disabled the like and dislike bar on the video, so poor was its reception. Thankfully, 2017 would see Metroid Samus Returns reviving the series and helping to at least regain Nintendo an amount of the respect that was lost in 2015. In the same press conference that Metroid Samus Returns was revealed as well, a fourth installment in the Metroid Prime series was announced with a teaser trailer. Since then, however, Metroid Prime 4 has had a turbulent development process, seeing no properly substantial updates up to this point. All we have right now are little scraps of info on the development of this game, now being handled by Retro Studios following the struggles seen at the Bandai Namco Singapore studio, who were previously developing the game originally. And outside the fan remakes, such as another Metroid 2 remake and the occasional ROM hack for Super Metroid, that covers about everything in the series so far. So let's set about wrapping this entire thing up and providing some closing thoughts on the game. Going into this review, I was worried about whether or not I would be able to do this game the justice that it deserves, because Super Metroid is supreme. It does everything that I could possibly ever want in a game, and then some. The control is superbly fluid, the combat is just the level of intensity that I want. It's open enough to let you have a nosy around whilst also giving you a few hints on where you could go if you somehow get lost. And it is all presented in a way that makes exceptional use of the hardware that is provided to the game by the Super Famicom. The only things I could possibly criticise are that the reserve tanks are there basically just to be different rather than useful, and that getting lost is still a very real possibility and problem, and the very occasional slowdown as well being a thing, but all of that is so minor in the grand scheme of things that it doesn't matter. If you are completely new to the Metroid franchise and you want a game to start you out, then really you have three options to pick from. Metroid Zero Mission if you want the best way to play the original game, Metroid Prime if you are looking for a lore-rich first-person game first and foremost, and Super Metroid, the game that lets you do pretty much whatever you want. And personally, of the three, Super Metroid is the one that I would recommend first. So, language requirements. The game is playable entirely in English with the option of Japanese subtitles for the moments when text may appear on the screen. The PAL versions have German and French options for subtitles, but every piece of text will be in English by default. As such, you can pick up this game without any concerns about understanding another language, and if you care about playing a game in full speed, you should aim for either the Japanese or American copies since it's 60Hz versus 50Hz. On that note, let's talk about importability. You can get a loose cartridge version of the game for anywhere between 1,000 to 2,000 yen, so in the ballpark of £15, and there's a fair number of listings for the game on Yahoo Auctions, so despite not being massively successful there, it isn't particularly rare. Box copies, on the other hand, are more expensive, so you can expect to pay somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 yen, or between £30 to £70. And of course, complete copies will invariably be more expensive. For most games I've reviewed, I've been somewhat edgy about whether they're worth the price that they can be found for on the internet. But in this instance, I would say that Super Metroid is absolutely worth the price. It offers replay value in spades. Your first game can be pretty long, maybe as much as 10 hours, while subsequent playthroughs can be quicker and quicker and quicker, just as they were for me. And the biggest reward for it all is what comes at the end of the game, at the credits roll towards their end. So, in conclusion, Super Metroid is an excellent action game for the Super Famicom, and everyone owes it to themselves to try it out at some point one way or another. It's not the cheapest game necessarily, but it is a game that is worth the price of admission. It is just that good. And with that, I bring my review of Super Metroid to a close. If you have any suggestions on what I should cover in a future episode, drop a comment below with what I ought to cover in the future, and also check out my collection on my website as well as my Twitter to keep up to date with everything I do, both of which are in the description down below. As ever though, this has been Daniel Learmouth. Sadi.